face. You're used to seeing Daniel Leonard, so I hope I live up to his standards and carry through with a wonderful program today. This is our first official session. We had a really good kind of special session in January. If you missed that, you can go on the Bay County YouTube site and view all of our gardening in the panhandles that we have had and review and learn. They're really fun to go back and watch if you haven't seen any of those. But again, Bay County YouTube Extension. We have got a great panel today, a new face we're going to introduce in just a minute. You may not have seen yet, but is really moving forward on our horticulture team. But I'm going to start with introductions here, and we're going to start right next door in Santa Rosa County with Stephen.
Hi, I'm Stephen Greer. I'm the County Extension Director, and my background is horticulture and turf grass management, so I enjoy that side of it. We're fortunate we have two horticulture agents also in Santa Rosa that are in it full time. I just fill in the gaps when it's going on, but I spent a few years doing this.
Just a few, Stephen.
Just
right?
a few.
Right. Yeah. So moving on east, Evan, if you'll say hello.
Hello, I'm Evan Anderson. I am the horticulture agent and master gardener coordinator in Walton County.
All right. And finally, moving pretty far east, we have Khadija, and she is just lighting up the Eastern Panhandle. We love her as part of our team, and you're going to learn so much. This is really her specialty. So welcome, Khadija.
Thank you, Beth. And like Beth said, I'm Khadija Scott. I'm the horticulture, agriculture, and natural resources extension agent for McCullough County, Florida.
And as always, we have to have a behind the scenes team. We have Josh over on Facebook from Santa Rosa County, Matt on our Zoom chat from Santa Rosa County, and of course, Julie is leading us in our tech behind the scenes. So really good team up here in the Panhandle. But let's get started right into it. And Stephen, I kind of wanted to get you set first. What does it small scale gardening mean when we talk about that? What are kind of the thoughts that brings to mind of what people are doing?
Well, I will define it a lot of times as limited scale or limited space type gardening, more of when you get into the container, small raised beds, such as a 4x4, 3x6, somewhere where you can step right out of the house into a small garden area. Oftentimes you'll see herbs and a few other things, or a single tomato plant, that kind of thing. And I look at the vegetables as more fresh produce, something you pick straight from there, take inside, prep, and eat and enjoy.
Well, yeah, we love fresh eating. Sometimes it's hard to even make it in the house with a lot of things.
It's true.
Well, Khadija, when we talk, let's kind of start with small scale and pots. Someone on our group asked, how big does that pot need to be? What do you need to look for if you're thinking about small scale gardening? Is it a gallon pot, a 5, 15? What would you kind of recommend for some different things for homeowners to consider?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely, it is definitely possible to grow in pots. When it comes to growing vegetables in containers, though, the bigger is going to be better. That bigger space is going to hold the most soil, the most water, the most nutrients. I like to start with pots that are a minimum of 18 inches or at least 5 gallons in volume. The only thing that's not going to work in pots is your like bigger sprawling vegetables like pumpkins and melons. But I've had great success with eggplants, tomatoes, green beans, okra. I've even grown corn and cucumbers and potatoes in pots, and I've had really good success.
Yeah, I mean, corn, you don't think about that one for us too much, but that'd be fun in a pot if you can get enough room.
Big enough pot, yeah.
We all love some corn for sure. Well, Khadija, on that note with the containers, is it a way to save soil? Because if you're talking about some bigger size containers, your biggest expense is probably the soil. Are there ways to save some money when looking to get soil or in your pots?
Yeah, absolutely. Your soil is probably going to be one of your biggest costs when you're starting to look at containers. There are only a few ways to reduce the amount of soil that you're going to have in a pot. And that's going to become through mixing in other materials that are inert. So mixing with that soil, mixing in some compost, some peat moss, decomposed bark is another one that I use to try to cut down on it, as well as vermiculite. You can also look at trying to do plants that don't need as much soil, such as some of your sweet peas and your runner beans and your other legumes won't need to have nearly as much soil in that pot as something like a potato would.
Okay, now, Stephen, this isn't on our list, but I know you know this answer. Should people be adding rocks and other things to the bottom of that pot to help?
I tend to use rocks for opening a potential drainage. The other part is the weight, because we do have windy days periodically, and I like to have a little bit of anchorage down in there. I've been known to have such large containers. I will take like miniature bottles and things and fill that space, so I'm not having so much near the bottom, because I always worry about water collecting and extreme moisture in that bottom third of the pot when they're real tall, and just kind of fill those spaces.
Okay, some good advice outdoors. We do have a few windy days here in Florida, as we've all experienced. Just a reminder, over in the chat, you will be seeing links to publications. If you miss some of the comments in the chat, don't worry. We're going to have an article that comes through Gardening the Panhandle with all of the questions and links later on. So don't be overwhelmed by that. So Evan, still on soil and containers, someone asked about tomatoes specifically. Can we reuse soil from year to year, or with tomatoes, is that something we need to totally discard, or can we kind of keep and save some money that way?
You can certainly reuse soil, with the caveat that if there was some terrible disease that wiped out all your tomatoes or any plant, I probably would replace the soil in that case. It's probably not worth the risk to grow in diseased conditions the following year. So yeah, that's fine. Just clean it up, get all the debris off, and make sure that nothing was terribly diseased in it.
Yeah, and I think homeowners, if they have a question, they can always give their office a call if they're unsure of whether to reuse or not, or what they've had in there. That's always good. So remember, we're always here for you. So moving a little bit from containers to raised beds. Stephen, what would be preferable of using a raised bed versus in-ground?
Well, I've always struggled with the definition of raised bed and trying to explain it, because I view raised beds as an elevated component. Some of the raised beds are actually connected to the soil area that's already pre-existing there, which runs other potential challenges. And then you're looking at more of a container, more of a raised bed where it's boxed in. Is it separated from the soil below, or is it directly contact? So the answer is yes to both. There's good points and challenging points with both of them. The one thing with our sandy soils we have here, if you're using that as a piece of incorporating with your organic amendments in let's just say a box bed that you've built, preferably at least a 12-foot side to it, because you really 12-inch side to it, because you really need some depth for that rooting material. But the organic amendments really help a lot, because I worry or have concerns quite often in our area, because we deal with a lot of organisms in the soil that are good and bad, really. Nematodes get a bad rap, but they're beneficial nematodes out there as well. And that's why I like to keep my organic amendment up, to keep that beneficial setting for those nematodes that are going to be positive and help continue to grow there.
And maybe some crop rotation too, right?
Most definitely. Rotation and understanding, do a little research and reading on your plants, or just like you mentioned earlier, go to the local extension office and talk to them about rotation. Because some of the things you might think are a totally different plant are still in the same plant family. And you might just be bringing in another feeding frenzy, in a manner of speaking. But the other part is mulching in those areas too, to reduce splash effect and moving some of those pathogens from the soil up.
Okay. Well, on that same note, Stephen, someone is going to have their first raised bed. What are some key pointers they should think about?
Do a little bit of behind the scenes work. We all use our iPhones now, or our smartphone technology, and look things up. They do sell a lot of kits online. Most of them come with recycled plastic or a type of cedar siding on them. What I like to look at is how much are you bending and stooping. And so in terms of raised beds, you may want to elevate it using actually post on the end to raise it up just a little bit easier. Either that, or make it so that you can easily just hands and knees and just kind of get down there quick. I don't like the beds to be much wider than 36 to maybe 38 inches wide, so you can harvest for both sides of it. Length is up to you. Typically, most people you'll see doing it are somewhere between 8 feet to 10 feet to 12 feet long, with a side shoulder board or recycled plastic of about 12 inches high so they can fill into that area.
Yeah, I think we've all seen where we've made a bed too wide and then you're trying to reach or having to walk in it. It's kind of a mess and not very good for our plants too.
Yeah, and you're looking, where am I putting my other hand as I'm trying to lean in? It's going to wind up in the bed somewhere.
It will. So that's a good key points there. Well, Evan, in a raised bed, what about plant spacing? Do we have to follow those exact, we don't necessarily have the same rows like we would in ground. So can we put things a little closer, or is spacing still just as critical?
It's pretty critical. The closer you get the plants, the less airflow you get between them. And that means the more humidity stays in there and the more diseases you'll get. So it is pretty important to follow the space recommendations that you find on the seed packet or on the little plant tag. I posted a little article there from Molly Jameson over in Tallahassee. She wrote up a kind of guide to plant spacing for a few common plants, but the spacing should be on the tag or the seed packet. So do follow those. I get people asking if you can plant zucchinis or watermelons in a raised bed, and the answer is yes, if you don't mind it taking over the whole raised bed and then some more of your yard after that. So just be aware that the plants aren't gonna, they're not gonna stay where they're put if they're the vining type of plants or anything like that. So give them space.
Yeah, those definitely need space, but I love the Seminole pumpkin. So that's one of my favorites that runs everywhere. Well, we're sticking with you, Evan. With these raised beds, we've seen where, if there's a soil problem, someone may have used a liner. Is that a good idea for most people, or should they just have the raised bed right on top of their existing soil?
That depends if you have a problem or not. If you have a particular problem with nematodes, you may want to put a layer of something down to keep them out of the garden. If you have rodents burrowing underneath, you might use wire, chicken wire, something like that to keep them from getting up in there. But if you haven't noticed a particular problem with those things, I'd probably skip it. It's probably just not worth the time and energy to put it in there. As long as your raised bed is deep enough to withstand, the plant roots getting down.
Yeah, at least I think Stephen said at least 12 inches, right?
Yeah, right. That's probably about the least I'd want to do. But if you have things like carrots or potatoes, you'll probably need a little more.
All right, Khadija, we're back to you. We want some of your expertise here. So with some of these crops we grow, we have our runners, we have our ones that stay in place, but we do have things that climb. So what are some kind of unique or interesting ways we can support those climbers using a container or a raised bed?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know for this person if they're looking for, I don't know if you're looking for hydroponic vertical options or just non-traditional vertical options, but vertical gardening can really be as complicated or as simple as you want it to be. If you're working with some of those climbing plants, you can use things like arbors, trellises, pergolas, hanging baskets. There's planter baskets that you can use, and there's also like pre-made vertical towers and pre-made vertical containers that you can use as well. There's also some new products I've seen coming out using these polystyrene boxes that can be manipulated. So it's this really, it's kind of like a fluffy plastic material that can be used on products. And then gutter gardening, that's one of the newest waves that I've been seeing introducing vertical gardening into the landscape. Right now in what color I'm working on experimenting with a living wall where we've got moss and different plants growing within a frame. So there's really a lot of options available for you. Your extension office will always be probably one of the best resources for that, as well as your local nurseries and garden centers.
So your living wall might have some strawberries in it at some time, right?
Hopefully so, most definitely. Just slowly integrating different types of herbs, especially cool season herbs this upcoming fall, and now transitioning into warm season herbs and strawberries as we move into the new times. So,
well, we'll look forward to seeing the success with the living wall. We can't wait. We'll have to talk about that again.
Okay, great.
We have another question. No one kind of grabbed this one, but I just wanted to throw it out. What about raised mounds? We always know we hear planting things on a mound like some of our running crops. Is that necessary? Do we need to do that, or can we just plant flat? Anyone want to grab that one?
I guess I'll step into it first. The answer is it depends, and part of it is your soil types and where your property is located that you're trying to grow in, and you have these potentially elevated spots. If you're in more of what I call the sand hills with the deep quartz sands, you may not need to elevate. Flat is fine. You may want to continue that way to keep the moisture a little bit closer to the plant, but in some of the heavier clays, as you get to the Alabama line, you may want to plant in mound settings. Or if you're in a more of a coastal area where there's a lot of wetlands, same thing, you'll want to elevate and grow.
Okay. Well, we're going to move a little bit out of containers and raised beds and talk kind of a hodgepodge of specific plants and general plant selections. And Stephen, we're going to start with you on this section about what is the best timing if we're going to start seeds. Now, we're going into the warm season, so at least start with that one. When would we start our seeds for our warm season garden?
Okay, well, it all comes down to the types of plant, or, if you're going with tomatoes, or you're looking at maybe going into that spring cycle with maybe trying to squeeze in some lettuce and get it in there and out before the season gets too hot. That's a direct to the garden bed. You're directly seeding, and boy, we're inching in. That probably already should have occurred, depending on where you are. Either coastal, some of this in here is at 9A, very warm, subtropical almost. And then you get more up around the I-10 side, and you're still having some cold weather. Tomatoes, if you're starting your seed with that, then you're looking at you need to start about 6 to 8 weeks before the date of the last frost, which sometimes that's a loaded question, when that last frost is. But we're in that right now. I started my tomato seeds about 8 to 10 days ago, which might be a touch early, but the lighting's been somewhat impacted by it. We've had a number of cloudy days, so it slows that process down.
Now, your tomato seeds inside, right?
Yes, and I do move them out to a porch area to get a little more of the real, what I call direct sunlight when I can. But today's not one of those sunny days.
No,
So it's inside.
not. We might need some supplemental lighting if we're going to think about some of that indoor growing.
That's the
to get
truth,
those
yes.
ready. Well,
Yes.
Evan, so we know kind of when to start seeds. What are some good varieties we should kind of think about planting coming up? What are the best ones that homeowners want to grow?
Well, there's so many different crops out there. I'm not going to start rattling off a list and have everyone scribble it down frantically. I'm going to point you toward the Vegetable Production Handbook of Florida, which is a thick old tome this year that has information on just about every crop you could want to grow, and there's some good variety recommendations in there for each one. So look at the beginning of each chapter. You can find that online. Some county offices may have physical copies if you drop by. It's more for larger scale gardens or farming operations, but it has a lot of good information even for small operations. So take a look at that and look for the varieties there. I can't promise you we'll be able to find all of the varieties, but we have recommendations.
Do y'all want to throw out maybe your favorite variety of your favorite crop you're going to grow this year?
I'll say, people ask about tomatoes a lot. I'll say Amelia has worked well for us, and a lot of the cherry tomatoes do really well.
Okay. Khadija,
Yeah.
what would you grow?
Same, tomatoes are one of my favorite crops to grow. I'm a fan of the Cherokee purple.
Not always the easiest, is it?
Not necessarily, no, but with proper plant maintenance and really good soil health, that's going to be the difference towards having successful tomatoes and not, especially when it comes to Cherokee purple.
Okay. Stephen, any favorites you're going to start?
Oh, I'll just go with the small sweet 100s, because it's an easy one. My boys come to visit and they just grab little hands full and eat them right outside while they're strolling around.
Yeah, I'm going to be growing some of the California Wonder Peppers. Good old, just old fashioned bell pepper. Nothing too crazy in this neck of the woods. Well, Evan, I'll throw this to you since you deal with a coastal environment. Should people do anything different on the coast with growing plants? They have more concerns in more inland situation?
Yeah, if you're growing right on the beach, you're gonna have a hard time. The salt spray is gonna, yeah, there's not a lot of things that grow in the garden that can handle salt, if anything. So be wary of that. If you're growing in straight beach sand, which, you know, for example, we have down on the south end of our county, you'll probably need to do a raised bed and add a lot of good organic matter to the soil, just so it can hold on to those nutrients in the water it needs to really thrive. You're probably also looking at a warmer climate, which means that pests and diseases can get a foothold and kind of stick around longer. So you have to be vigilant on those. But again, if you have any problems and need specific advice for your location, talk to your local county extension agent, and we can help you out.
Okay. Well, we're going to get into a little bit of your favorite summer vegetable or fruit, actually a fruit, our good old tomatoes. So Stephen, if people are going to start tomatoes, you started yours, but if they haven't, they can still grow tomatoes, right?
Yes, they can. You know, if, you know, the other thing is you can go to your local garden center or greenhouse and find your tomatoes there as well in like little 6-packs and those kinds of things. One thing I will caution, if you do buy plants to tomatoes to transplant, don't buy the one that's so big and already setting tomatoes on it. It's kind of an interesting thing to want to buy it and watch that one grow, but the plant hasn't had enough time to establish its roots as it's going along. So be cautious with that. But when you're looking at tomatoes, determinate is a type of tomato that more is a bush type. And then you have the indeterminate, like the old standard Better Boy, Beefmaster, those types, it'll just sprawl all over the place. And that takes some staking.
What else would an average homeowner need to kind of think about with tomatoes that can help them have a good start?
Well, I hope some soil samples have been taken a number of weeks ago or even several months ago to really know what your pH levels are and what you're starting with there, and determining with the agent's help a little bit of the nutrient needs and some of those pieces. Other than that, you're a level of a guessing game what the plant and the soils, what's really needed to get it its best performance. Be careful to water, but don't overwater. And no overhead irrigation or splashing over the leaf surface. It needs to go directly to the soil itself, like drip irrigation systems. And they've got homeowner kits you can put together that connects us right to a garden hose, and just keep that water where it needs to be. And careful with your fertilization. In the early stages, there will be a couple of applications just to get the plant and the vegetative part going with the leaves up to healthy size. But as you're getting near, as you can tell, get a feel within a couple of weeks, you're starting to see blooms beginning to show and going to soon set. You want to be very careful about not adding much fertilizer then, because it can blow the blooms off.
Yeah, and that water is critical. We know as we get into a warmer season, we need to keep that consistent, right? What can that lead to? Khadija, are you familiar with the blossom end right? Can you explain that one?
Well, you wanted me to talk about disease prevention with blossom end right?
Yeah, go ahead and share that
one of the best ways to prevent blossom end right is, like Stephen was saying, is your soil test. Typically you see that with a calcium deficiency. And so one of the best ways you're going to prevent that issue is by having a soil test and actually knowing the nutrients that are in your soil so that you may properly amend it. That's going to be your biggest, and for most crops, the biggest defense in disease management is going to be proper soil health.
Good. And that consistent watering will lead you in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Stephen, back to you on tomatoes for small spaces. What are some good selections if someone's growing in a container or a small space for good yield? They want a lot of tomatoes, but they don't have a lot of room.
Okay. Well, you almost have what I call single cluster type tomatoes, you know, the determinate type, the type that'll grow to a certain height and really slow down on that piece. That way you've got with limited space or small space, you're keeping it within reason. The other side of that is you get a lot of production of tomatoes coming in a short window of time. So you got to figure out, is there a way I can actually save them for a little bit longer and spread them out over a little time period once they've been harvested. Celebrity is one of those good old standbys, the bush types. But there's a number of them out there. I'd suggest doing a little bit of research and looking at some of the things. The guide that Evan mentioned a little bit ago, that's a really good one to reference back to. It'll talk into some detail about that as well. If you're looking at a small space, but you've got space to go up, you can go to the indeterminate side and grow one of our tomatoes that have been around forever, like the old Beefmaster. It produces about a 10 to 12 ounce tomato, which is pretty good sized. By the way, the celebrity tomato on the determinate is about an 8-ounce size fruit.
Oh, I'd like, yeah, big sandwich tomato. Delicious.
Yes.
We're ready for summer in that aspect, not the heat necessarily, but for the tomato. Evan, quickly, last one on tomatoes. Do you recommend pruning tomatoes?
So the theory behind pruning or suckering, as people call it, is taking off those little side shoots to increase the size of the tomatoes. You get a few less fruits overall. It's really up to personal preference. So if you want more tomatoes, you might leave those on. The plant gets bushier and thicker, so you might have to keep more of an eye out on disease, but it's really up to personal preference.
Yeah, and I saw in the chat, they did put a link to pruning tomatoes. So if you need some more information, look for that when we get our article out. Well, Evan, we're kind of moving to a different plant here, but we had someone who asked about pole beans this spring. Let us know a little bit about growing some pole beans.
Yeah, usually you can direct seed those starting in March, April. That's about the time period I'd say. We've got a link in the chat for a chapter of that vegetable production guide that I mentioned. Most of the beans we have are good at that time. If you want to grow something through the heat of the summer, a lot of those beans will not like it, but your southern peas or your yard-long beans, those can withstand the heat. So those you could plant a little later and still get successfully.
Yeah, we had fun with fava beans last year. Everyone was just intrigued with that plant. So we're going to do that one again for sure. Someone asked in the chat about a soil testing kit. You can get that at every county extension office, but we have a new soil testing option that will be coming available down the road. So that was one where you'll get the whole kit. You can send a sample off and it's all packaged together. But don't look for that one for vegetables right off the bat. But in the future, that one will be available at our office as well. So Khadija, we're kind of moving to a different group of plants here, but with edibles, are there any Florida friendly or native edibles people can grow for the summer garden?
There are just a few, not too many options when it comes to perennials. The most common ones that you'll see in this area would be like the sweet potato vine and the Jerusalem artichoke. But there are also options for herbs that are perennial, such as turmeric or onions or shallots, depending on your area. The multiple types are the ones that you want to look at, the multiplying ones. But not too many options, but you do have a few. Another one that's pretty common in this area is going to be that edible taro root that you see growing a lot of the times. It's also good for people that are in a more waterlogged area. But again, your county extension office is going to be your best option for getting more specifics that work in your area.
Yeah, I love the turmeric because that's a beautiful bloom later on. People don't realize the bloom that comes on is just gorgeous on that plant.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, one of our natives, we have our dewberry. It's kind of more in the fruit realm, but dewberry is one of them. It's not the most enjoyable to pick and get through. But Stephen, on that note, do we have any thornless blackberries that really do well for us on the Panhandle of Florida?
Oh, we do. When the thornless blackberries started coming out really significantly in the 80s, they weren't great. I hate to put it that way. They just didn't carry the bricks or the sugar in the fruit production, and they were what I would call rangy. They were more of a trailing type that just went, oh gosh, you'd have pieces growing out 6 and 8 and 10 feet in a year. So now they've really done a lot of work, and a number of it is coming out of Arkansas with the university there. They've kind of led the way on it for a number of years, but here in Florida, when you're looking at the labels, make sure you get one that says erect. That's one that tends to be a little bit less growth habit, tends to more stand up on its own somewhat. There's several out there, the selections. You might want to look at Freedom or Osage or Traveler. Those are all three good ones. If I had my choice, it'd be the Osage because the sugar content's better. The fruit's a little bit smaller, but it's got a really good flavor to it and juicy.
You know, we've been growing Arapaho for several years, and
Mhm.
our cooler winters, that chill has kind of helped them come on. So, you know, blackberries are really my kind of go-to because it's low maintenance.
Yes, and you know where you I know where you live, so I know in that temperature zone you're probably getting about 300 chilling hours in there, and that's really helpful with setting the bloom and fruit that you really need to have happen with them.
Yeah, so yeah, I love blackberries. It's good to recommend if you're kind of getting started. Blackberries is a good one. Now, you're not going to have a long harvest time that the birds and you are going to be fighting for sure.
The one thing I'll be recommend being careful with is don't over fertilize them. You wind up with a lot of vegetative growth, a lot of stem growth, and it becomes hard to manage them. So once they're established and have that organic base in there, they're pretty well self-sustaining on that piece of it.
So everyone's going to have great success with blackberries this year. Well, Khadija, on another note with gardening, what about plants for those who have not as much sunlight? Maybe they have partial sun. Are there some kind of edible things they can grow that will work in that partial sun area?
Yeah, there's always going to be options for that. It's really just going to be dependent upon which season we're talking about. If we're growing in the springtime, late fall, if we're growing in the summertime. Herbs to me have always been a really good addition to a shady vegetable garden. Most of your herbs, leafy green herbs, are going to do just fine in a partial shade area. And then your greens as well during the springtime as well as the fall. Those leafy greens like broccoli and cauliflower, lettuces, those also tend to do well with having less sunlight than necessary. It's always ideal to have at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight when you're dealing with your vegetables. But if you can at least get 4 hours of sunlight, then everything that I just mentioned should qualify under that.
And if you're growing in a pot, you might can move it around. to
Yep,
take advantage.
absolutely.
I like that idea, although I may need help moving the pot from time to time. Well, Khadija, you kind of have a specialty that maybe our viewers don't know about. You've worked a lot with community gardens. So what are some good things and good plants to grow in community gardens that those members really have success with?
Yeah, so community gardens are a great opportunity to provide food access on a local system. When it comes to community gardening, though, less is better, and just starting off with a really small space. And when it comes to the vegetables that you plan to grow, start with the things that you and the members of your community are actually going to eat. Because what you don't want to plant a whole bunch of corn and then nobody actually eats corn. And so now you've wasted all of that space that could have been used for something else. So definitely grow something that you intend to eat that you're not going to waste. And then moving from that, I would actually look at the IFAS's gardening guide, because it does provide specific varieties for everything that you plan to eat. So if you say, hey, I know we're going to eat, spinach, kale, arugula, carrots this winter, go on to IFAS's guide and then find you some varieties that specify that they work in this area for you, and then move forward from there.
Yeah, I love that statement. If people don't like corn, I don't know who those people are, though. I've never met those people who don't like corn. Well, Evan, we've had some questions about a couple of kind of what we consider cool season crops moving into warm season, but someone wanted to know, do beets do well here? And then what about potatoes?
So yeah, you can grow beets. I don't think this is the favorite location for them, but they'll grow. We've got some publications on growing root crops and potatoes in our area, so check those out. Potatoes, yeah, you can do those as well. Those probably a little bit better than beets. If you're over in St. Johns County, you might have a really good time with potatoes. That's actually a fairly sizable crop over there. But If you really want to get something through the summer, I'd try sweet potatoes. Those do really well in our area. That's a very good choice.
When are people planting the new potatoes?
You're probably looking about the same time as most of your other spring crops, I believe. And anyone correct
Yeah.
me if I'm wrong, but
I've seen seed potatoes available. Is that, Khadija, do you know with seed potatoes, you seeing those in your nurseries yet?
I have not actually seen them yet.
Okay.
They are not, I know it's getting ready to be time to plant, but they're not in the nurseries available right now, no.
Well, hopefully we'll see them soon because I love some new potatoes. And then the summer long season of the sweet potato. If you want a long season crop, there you go, right? Well, Khadija, you mentioned a plant earlier that would grow in kind of wet soils. And some of us have these low areas in our landscape and we don't have a lot of other options for growing edibles. Are there some plants that would do well or a few that may tolerate some wet feet?
Yeah, again, this is kind of one of those areas where you don't have as much options because most of the vegetables that are able to tolerate a wetter soil cannot tolerate the hot temperatures that we have here in the Panhandle region. So it doesn't hurt to experiment, though. I would always say try it. That edible taro, like I was talking about earlier, those elephant ears is a good edible perennial that's going to do well in a wet area. Some of your herbs like arugula and fennel will also tolerate wet feet. If somebody has some more options that I'm not thinking of, there's really only not too many options depending on how wet that area actually is. Does any of the other panelists want to chime in?
Anything? I'm kind of at a loss too. A lot of it needs
Yeah,
well-drained soil.
Mhm.
For
There's really
sure.
not a lot of options.
Maybe some watercress, huh? You could try that. Evan, if people want to garden with children, what are some good options for them to include grandchildren or kids in the mix?
yeah, that's a good question. I posted a link to an article on why is exposure to nature important in early childhood, which doesn't directly answer the question, but it should give you some ideas why it's important to get kids involved in gardening and outdoor activities, which can then kind of guide your ideas about what to plant. So if you're aiming for whatever the benefits are that you want, you can choose plants based on that. So if you're wanting a tactile garden, you can get things that the kids can get in there and touch. Herbs are good for that. You know, some of them have fuzzy leaves or they can pick a little bit off and taste it right then. Anything that's quick to grow, like radishes, are kind of a more immediate payback on your investment in time, and that can be good. Things that the kids can pick and eat right then, like sugar snap peas or the cherry tomatoes that are real sweet. Those can get kids excited instead of waiting for something like okra to grow over a long period of time, and then you get a spiky, slimy thing, and you can't pick that right off the bush and eat it. So that's kind of the sort of thing I'd be aiming at.
So you grew up with slimy okra, huh? Not the most appealing. Yeah, I love stevia because that's always a fun one to show and let everyone taste the stevia and the sweetness.
Yeah,
of
that's
it.
an herb that's like a sugar substitute. So that can
Definitely.
be surprising.
Now, everyone's favorite topic now, pest management. So Evan, we're going to stick with you on pest management and getting us started. What do we need to think about for some of these summertime edibles coming up in our small pots and raised beds that are going to be what we need to address?
So there's a lot of pests out there. Again, this is Florida and we have hot, humid weather, and a lot of things can survive well, even during the winter, unless we get a cold snap like we did this year. That might kill off some of the pests. But even so, you're looking at insects, you're looking at diseases like fungal diseases, occasionally a bacteria or virus, but constant scouting is important. So keep an eye on your plants, know what to look for. If you have a particular group of pests in your area that comes back every year, keep an eye on it and treat as necessary. I think we're posting some information on pest control there. There's landscape and garden pests in Florida, and then something on integrated pest management. So a lot of people will reach for the spray, the pesticide, the insecticide immediately, but there's some things you can do up front that's called integrated pest management, which means using a bunch of different methods to try and get a little bit of control each until you get a good amount of control. So that would be things like choosing plants that are resistant to diseases, using biological controls like maybe releasing predators into your garden, like ladybugs or lacewings that can control some of the insects for you, using the less impactful chemical sprays like neem oil, horticultural oils like that, insecticidal soap, BT, those sorts of things. Lots of different options there for pest control, but scouting is the first step, and knowing what you're looking at before you try and kill everything out there. So again, contact your local extension office for help in identifying anything, any problems that you come across.
Yeah, you can always send us a picture. We're happy to help with that. Well, Evan, one last pest. What about this squash vine borer? That can really ruin someone's afternoon.
Yeah, I saw somebody ask about leaf-footed bugs and squash vine borer. Leaf-footed bugs are pretty mobile. They're big stink bugs. You can try a trap crop for those. They seem to like sunflowers really well. So if you plant those, you might attract the bugs to that, and then you can pick them off, drop them in some soapy water, or spritz them with some horticultural oil or something like that while they're on the other plant and not on your crops. For vine borer, that's a little bit more difficult because it's a moth that lays its eggs on squash or viney plants. The larva burrows into the stem, eats its way around in there, and it's pretty well protected from anything you do. So I usually recommend people who have a particular problem with this either try to cover the plants with row cover fabric during the early growing season. Once they put out flowers, you can take that off and let the pollinators at the flowers. Or if you really have to, you can cut a vertical slit in the stem and dig out the grub, which is difficult and gross and may damage the plant. So little prevention in this case is better than trying to deal with the problem once you've got it.
All right. Well, Stephen, I know we have kind of a question on companion planting. Is that something you would recommend in a small scale garden, is to throw some flowers or something else amongst your edibles?
Yeah, and I guess you're leaning around to the question where they were asking about cut flowers and the vegetables in the same place, or is this a different?
Well, this is just general. You can get to that one. That's fine.
Okay.
Cover it
Well,
too.
that's all right. I can hold off on that. But companion planting is a rather intriguing thing to do. Like Evan talked about, certain plants tend to attract more than others. Like you're getting companion planting, and you may have some beans in with some corn and that kind of thing, where it's almost hiding in a way. And when you're planting more of a singular crop in a given setting, it just is a greater attractant for a larger number of a given pest. If things are kind of spread around and mixed and that kind of thing, it makes it harder for them to hone in on it, in a manner of speaking.
And flowers make everything prettier too. We like that.
Yes, they do.
For sure. Well, go ahead, Stephen, and continue with using the cut flowers in an edible or small space area with some vegetables. Cover
Okay.
that.
Well, it's the way I grew up as a kid, watching people in the community when I grew up with acre type gardens. So it was actually part of the significant part of life, where we kept the product in all kinds of different ways, from canning to all sorts of ways to dry product. But in those settings, it was always beautiful because you'd see these long rows of all types of different flowers growing. And I just thought they were there just for looks. And they were. And they would also be cut and taken indoors and those kinds of things, such as sunflowers and zinnias, maybe some snapdragons. By the way, my grandmother's the one that taught me about snapdragons, where you squeeze the base and it pops open. But marigold's used. It's often used as an attractant as well for specific type of pest. It works fairly well, but it's just the color enjoyment. What you need to do is plot out your garden and decide where you want to have these. Typically, the flowers and things are on the perimeters to, as Evan mentioned, a trap crop to attract those pests into that area and not get to your actual true production area. And then work on your vegetables and have them spaced specifically and timed out how they're going to come into production, preferably before the specific identified major pest on that crop has a chance to really get there. And sometimes that's where more of the frost protection materials, the cloth materials you can drape over with hoops to allow a little bit of warming and keeping that temperature just a couple of degrees higher, and you get that product in and out before those pests get really all over the place. But I kind of went sideways on that question, but I think I
Well, it's
answered.
all good information. Well, what's your favorite cut flower to add in?
Mine,
Yeah.
actually, I prefer the sunflower because I do a lot of floral work just for fun, for family and things. And that's that kind of that hallmark piece. It really makes a big statement in a given floral design.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, we all, and there's so many different types of sunflowers.
Yeah,
That's a
just
big
check
crop.
them before you bring them in so you're not bringing in a couple of bugs with you when you come.
No leaf-footed bugs hanging out on your sunflowers in the house. Not always fun. Well, Khadija, back to some of the pest management ideas with tomatoes. What's some good disease management techniques people can have to just help prevent those from taking over their tomato plants?
Yeah, absolutely. Evan, like you pointed to integrated pest management, using those biological and cultural controls together to make sure that we are protecting our plants. The biggest thing with tomatoes is going to be monitoring your environmental conditions and scouting, because that's where most of their diseases are going to come from. For tomatoes specifically, I'd always recommend that you make sure you're monitoring your water. And a lot of times that overhead irrigation or overhead watering can really aggravate disease. And just managing your weeding as well, and getting rid of any volunteer plants that you may have. Sometimes you'll notice if you planted tomatoes, another tomato that wasn't supposed to be planted starts growing up during the middle of the season. So get rid of those volunteer plants as well, even if they are not considered weeds in your mind. Another really good thing I also like to allude you guys to the IFAS article about tomato disease prevention in Florida. It also has some great recommendations, more advanced for doing like soil fumigation and monitoring your soil pH.
Yeah, good old layer of mulch too, huh?
Mhm.
We love that. Well, we're watering so much in the summer, we are going to have some ants in the garden. Evan, what's a good way to help manage some of those ants we don't want around our edibles?
Yeah, fire ants seem to like any surface that kind of holds a little bit of heat, and the edges of raised beds are good at that. So you'll often see either on the inside or the outside of the raised bed, you'll see a fire ant mound starting up. I don't know of any way to keep them out because they can, the new queens and everything, they can fly. So if your neighbor has fire ants, and they do, you'll probably have some eventually. Once they're there, control is, you can try things like pouring boiling water on the mound after a rain. Hopefully the queen will be up there and will die from that, but keep that off of your crop plants because that'll kill them too. The other option that I would use in a raised bed is the bait granules that you can get at the store. And be aware that there are two different kinds of granules you'll find. One you have to water in, which kind of soaks down in the nest. I'd probably avoid that in a raised bed, but there are bait granules that the ants take back into the nest and feed to the queen. And you can get away with using a lot less active ingredient with those. And you might not even necessarily need to put it in the bed itself, just nearby, so that the ants find it, pick it up, take it back to the nest, kill the queen, and then your problem's delayed until the next round.
Yeah, that's a good article too. So read that one in the chat when you get to your newsletter, because some of these products aren't labeled for gardens. So we have to be careful with that aspect of it. Stephen, with all the rain we get in Florida, when we're growing some of these squash and zucchini and melons, is there any way to prevent split or mildew or over ripening too quickly? What can people do?
We are known as the Sunshine State, but we do have a lot of rainy days and cloudy days, just like you'll find anywhere in the Southeast. And do a little bit of observation and looking at your where you're wanting to grow these. Make sure that it's a full sun area. You may want to go to raised beds we talked about earlier. So you've got good soil drainage. The other side of this is look at space areas where you have good air movement, or I refer to air drainage, because the quicker you can dry the leaf surfaces, the better. Years ago, when I was in the golf course industry, we would have fans, large fan systems, where would move and flip the air on the surface of the green itself to dry that leaf surface and prevent disease problems. So just think about those pieces. The other side I mentioned earlier too is also mulching where you're growing these with different types of thing, a hay product or a pine straw product, whatever you can find for mulching bark material, to prevent that rain and irrigation or whatever is occurring from splashing those micro droplets up onto the leaves and moving potential diseases from that soil setting up onto the plant.
Yeah, and one great piece of information I learned with tomatoes is don't let them fully ripen on the plant and give a chance to split. Harvest early and let them ripen inside. That always helps.
I haven't learned that lesson apparently.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Oh,
I know
yeah.
it's hard to get out there and do it, but
I tell myself when I'm coming in the evening, oh, go get the tomatoes. And then it winds up 2 days later. And yes, guess what? We had several rains and we have splits.
yeah, we all were faced with that. We did have a really interesting question that Khadija, I'm going to let you take, about a hydroponic method, the crack key method of hydroponics, where the solution I think is lower than your plants and lettuce. And is that better than just planting something like lettuce in the soil or a pot?
Yes, that was correct. Your definition of the cracky method. It's just a passive hydroponic technique that is growing plants where your plants are actually suspended above a reservoir of water. And that water is typically filled with nutrient solution. In general, hydroponics, land and water use are both going to be more efficient. You're typically using less water and you're also using less space. The cracking method is supposed to be, and it's intended to be, the most affordable method for growing hydroponically. And it's also pretty simple. That method can be used whether you're small scale, you're commercial, you're rural, or you're urban. So it's very efficient in reducing the amount of water that you're using as well as your space.
Pretty neat. Yeah, if you want to try hydroponics, that's a good way to start and get your feet wet, so to speak. We're going to finish up with a few questions here where you have a little bit of time, but these are kind of just a random group of questions. Stephen, we've got broccoli right now coming on. Is there a way to encourage more smaller florets once we cut that main head off?
Well, the thing you have to keep in mind, that primary head that you harvest or planning on harvesting, that is the floral, the cluster of flowers that you'll have that you're harvesting. You're eating the flower head, in a manner of speaking. Oftentimes we want that to fully and get as big as possible so we can brag to the neighbors and show it on clips, and so people can see what you're producing at home. But often you want to get to it just a little bit earlier, just like you mentioned about the tomatoes. You want to get to it when it's still kind of a very tight and young head and harvest that when it's still a nice size. The other side of this, once it's removed, you're going to refrigerate it, and then you're going to come back to that plant and continue to maintain it similar like you did. Oftentimes I'm guilty of, well, I've got that primary head harvest, and I start moving and paying attention to other things and don't properly keep the broccoli watered and those kinds of things, and it begins to stress and some of those parts. So you do get a secondary smaller heads. Well, I wouldn't even call them heads, but little pieces of broccoli florals coming up on the side shoots that you can harvest. There's not really, I wouldn't really recommend that late into the plant growth and health, no additional fertilizers and things. You just want to keep the moisture consistent for it so it can push those last few. And then you have to make that decision, okay, I've got enough off of it. I'm not going to keep pushing it because it's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. It's time to get something else rotated into the garden.
Yeah, I think broccoli is one of my favorite winter edibles. It's just that fresh broccoli has the most wonderful flavor.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, we're going to finish up with one question. Khadija, I'm going to let you start. What vegetables would you recommend for small scale for coming into March that people have ready to go in the March garden?
Yeah, absolutely. So weather dependent, March is a great time, so you can begin planting some of your warm season crops so that you would have a late spring harvest. So thinking of crops like beans, tomatoes, squash, and corn, and then potentially, depending on weather, again, you may also be able to get one final crop of some of your cool season crops, like your carrots and your celery and things such as that, radishes. Celery, not so much here in this zone, but Swiss chard and some of those others cool season crops for sure.
Yes, Stephen, anything else you would add to that list that as a must for the garden?
A must.
Yeah.
This sounds a little bit odd, but I will try and sneak in a little quick lettuce, some of the leaf lettuce, just real fast, just, get the seed out, get it up quickly. I typically will cover it just to keep the moisture for quick germination and begin picking them in about 30 days to 40 days.
And Evan, is March too early for like cucumbers and okra, or can people start thinking about that?
You can start thinking about it. Yeah,
Okay.
that should be fine.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good start here for small gardens and containers and raised beds and small spaces. We've kind of come to the end of our session a little bit early, but we got through most all the questions we had. We want to thank our panelists for being here today. Again, you have a survey that is going to be in the link. Please fill that out. And for those of you too, in about 6 to 8 weeks, you are going to be receiving a follow-up survey from me that will ask you if you put any of the things you've learned into practice. Please complete that. I wanted to let you know too, our next Gardening in the Panhandle is a really special event. We are going to be promoting our month-long No Mow March, which is all about pollinators and how to increase habitat and plant diversity for those pollinators. So join us for that next month on Gardening the Panhandle Live, and also look for activities in your county and our release of that weeks. I want to thank our behind the scenes crew, Julie, Josh, and Matt. They keep things rolling for us. And if you have any more questions, don't worry, you know where we are. We are all in our county offices throughout the Panhandle, ready to help at any time. So thanks everyone for being here, and we'll see you next month.